Hello, my name is Cosette Hansen, and welcome to my first YouTube video. I really wanted to create a video blog to share my experience in my career as a theater practitioner. I recently finished writing my very first play called Every Tiny Second, and I plan on performing it very soon. Um, so I just wanted to give some of the advice and things that I learned through the process of creating and writing my first play. So here are 10 things that I have been able to learn through writing Every Tiny Second. So the first tip is that um, try not to do any kind of revising or editing until you already have a first draft. A lot of people will say that the first draft of something is always going to suck and you just have to accept that. But the thing is I don't think that first drafts suck. I think that they just, after you've already written something, like the more you write, the better you get at writing. So if you go back and look at things you wrote before, you could be like, oh, that's not that great. But that doesn't mean that the idea wasn't there, and that doesn't mean that it was bad. Like, I mean, I think I enjoyed my first draft of Every Tiny Second. I think was pretty good, but through editing and revising, I was able to make it better. But the thing is if I had the voice in my head telling me to edit and revise all this stuff as I was writing, like trying to create like the perfect first draft, then that would have been like, it would have been detrimental to my writing because I wouldn't have been able to finish the draft that I did have, you know. And at once you have a draft, your confidence is always like really high. You're like, okay, I have this draft now. Now I can edit it, you know. Um my second piece of advice is to share your work with other people. Once you have your first draft, sometimes you can get into this biased mode of being like, oh, my writing is so perfect and I don't need to change anything. But when you show it to other people, they can really help you to understand the flaws in it and what you need to change and how to change it. And like, there were so many things about my characters I didn't even know or realize until um other people pointed it out to me. And one thing that was really helpful for me was just to be able to gain the confidence of taking something that I wrote and showing it to other people. It makes it more real. It makes it so it's not just something in your head anymore. It makes it so it's something that you're actually showing to people. So it gains a lot of confidence too. Um, you just got to make sure that you're not like overly cocky, like, oh, it's already perfect, I don't need to change anything. Like, these people who give you advice and feedback are giving it to you to help your play or your story get better. The third tip that I have that I really try to do with Every Tiny Second, and what I've been trying to do with the new things that I've been writing recently, is try and take the audience's expectations and kind of turn it on its head. Play with the audience's expectations. There are a lot of common themes and tropes in literature that is what the audience expects to happen, you know? When I created my characters in Every Tiny Second, I purposely wanted each of them to match a specific high school stereotype. So then I could take that stereotype and kind of turn it on its head and show that there's a lot more depth to them than what the audience originally thought. And being aware of these tropes and these like ways that people see, like, expect things to go, you can play with that and say, oh, you thought it was going to go in this direction, I'm actually going to have it go in this direction. And that keeps your audience engaged. You don't want to do that too much because, you know, you don't want your plot twist to like come out of nowhere, but just make sure that you're aware of the expectations and try to get out of the expectations. I think that's what creates a really good story, is when things don't go the way that you expect them to go. So when I was editing my play, after I had my first draft, I had people look over it. The first time I started editing it, I edited directly from the first draft. I cut things out and pasted in other things and just edited right from that first draft. Somebody who I know actually gave me the suggestion that instead of deleting things from the first draft or adding things to the first draft, you step away from the first draft and completely rewrite the entire thing. And that's when somebody first told me that, I was like, what, you want me to rewrite my entire play? But it's not really rewriting the entire thing, because once you have that first draft, you know what you wrote well enough that you can put it on paper. It's just, you get away from the bias of attachment to things that you had in there that are problematic. Also, like I said before, the more you write, the better of a writer you become. So after you finish your first draft, you're a better writer. So when you go back and rewrite those first scenes that you wrote before you finished, it gets a lot easier, because you already wrote, you're a better writer. And with the feedback that you've gotten from the other people who read your play, you can figure out how to condense things, make things more concise and more able to be easily interpreted by the audience and stuff. And for me, when somebody gave me the suggestion to just step away from the first draft and just rewrite it, it really, really helped me, because I was kind of trudging through mud a little bit with my editing, and I finally was able to get my play where it needed to be when I decided to just step away from the first draft for a little bit. So in my contemporary theater class, our teacher kind of said that only the protagonist is usually the one who has character depth and grows and has development. But I think in a really good, well thought out story, every character should have an arc and should have development. For Every Tiny Second, I decided that I didn't really want a protagonist in that story, because I have my 4 main characters, and I wanted them all to go on their own journey and their own arc, and have the story be about their friendship. But I think even in stories when there is just one protagonist, every single character needs to feel real. Every character needs to feel like they're human, because that's what's interesting. Plot is very important, and I'll never say that plot isn't important, but characters are really what hold the structure of a story together. You have to be able to make the characters relatable and understandable to the audience. And people, as human beings, they don't stay the same person through their entire life. They change and they evolve and they grow. And I think characters should be the same way. If you have a play that takes place in the span of 4 years, the people at the end of the 4 years are not going to be the same as the people at the beginning of the 4 years, because it's just, people change, And I think what's really at the meat of a lot of stories is being able to view that change in the characters. So I'm actually, right now, I'm working on a new project, which is going to be a book, and it's not going to be in play format. And what I found really hard writing that right after writing a play is actually having to describe stuff, actually having to describe what people look like with words, and like actually having to like be all flowery with the language of the setting or how characters look. But the thing about plays is you don't really have any of that. You have stage directions, but they're very... I try to keep my stage directions pretty basic, because I want the actors and the director, the designer, to be able to have room to work, room to design things, you know, and not have to be so structured. Also, one thing I did when I was writing Every Tiny Second is I purposely didn't give any of my characters a race or a description of how they look like, because I wanted my characters to be brought to life by whatever actors played them. I didn't really feel like there needed to be a physical description, you know? And that's just one of the differences I found between writing a book and writing a play. But what's hard about writing a play is that there is no description. It's all dialogue. Everything you learn about the characters, everything you learn about what's going on, it's all through what characters say. We don't get... With books, you kind of are lucky because you kind of have this magnifying glass into like all of the psyche and the emotions and the what's going on inside of a character. You don't really get that in a play. All you get is what they say, you know? And obviously it's up to the actors to try to get into that psychological area of who the characters are and what their internal world is, and I obviously did try to get there, but it's about... With dialogue being so important in a play, you have to make sure every single line that is said either moves the plot along or says something about the character. Now, the interesting thing about dialogue is, what I found is, for example, if a character says, "I'm fine," it could totally mean a lot of different things. It could mean, "I'm genuinely fine," but it could also mean, "I'm about to commit suicide, please help me." You know, it's like, it just depends on how they say it and the context of the scene, so you gotta make sure that's taken into account. And I think that, like, for Every Tiny Second, my first draft was really wordy, but when I edited it, I kind of figured out how to make people say things in a more direct way that wasn't like going off on a tangent and all. Dialogue's really hard to write, but it's also very fun too, because when you have two characters that have a very specific dynamic and they're on stage together and you're writing a scene with them together, when you know your characters enough, it's like it's so hard to describe. It's almost like you're talking to yourself. It's almost like you're talking to a best friend, because you know who these characters are so well that you know exactly what they're going to say to each other and you know exactly how they're going to interact with each other. I mean, I always say that, like, my characters are like my best friends, because writing for them, it was like texting about good friend. It was, because it's like when you get these people who you know so well, you just like, I know how Sammy would react to this. Ari and James are in this scene. I know exactly how James would react to Ari doing this. And it's really interesting. Playwriting is just so cool in the fact that you get to know your characters so well. With Every Tiny Second, one of the biggest things that I did that I think really made the play really great is that all of my characters were extensions of myself, almost. And obviously they kind of grew from that as I developed them more, but I put a lot of who I was into my characters and into the whole story itself. The whole idea started because I was inspired by my own high school experience and my own friends in high school. But you kind of have to take, when you're writing, you do kind of have to go to darker places in your life and try to take those dark places and put them into your characters in a realistic and believable way. Now, I haven't gone through all the things that my characters have gone through, but what I do is I find something similar that I have gone through and kind of put that into my writing, which is kind of an actor's perspective of things too. I just really wanted to get into the psyche of these characters and get into, like, what makes them tick and all that. But a lot of it, like 90% of it was me just, like, venting my own emotions onto the screen. And I think taking yourself and taking who you are and putting it into a story is really what makes a story come to life and makes it relatable to all people. So, for example, one of my characters, Ari, her whole story arc was about her sister and her relationship with her sister. Now, I have all brothers, and I've never had a sister before, but I took the relationship I had with my brothers, and I really tried to put it into the relationship between the two sisters in my play. It's kind of like that. It's like you have to try to find things that are in yourself and put it into the play or into whatever you're writing. I think a lot of it is being willing to be vulnerable and being willing to really tap into, like, the darker sides of you to be able to put it out there and put it into something that can be created into art. And through being vulnerable in the characters you create and in the world you create, you're able to connect to other people. You're able to have your work, have your writing be relatable because you're putting humanity into it. So, because human beings, they're, like, not caricatures. They're not, like, one-dimensional people. Like, the last line in my play is, life doesn't have any one-dimensional characters. So the important thing is to try to make the characters as human as possible and as multi-layered as you possibly can. And I think that goes for all of any character, not just the protagonist. My next tip is you have to keep writing and keep working at it even if you don't feel like it. When I was writing Every Tiny Second, I kind of made it a goal to, I knew I wanted to get it done, so I kind of made it a goal to be like, okay, no matter what, I'm going to write at least a couple sentences or a couple words every single day. Because when you force yourself to keep doing it and keep writing, then you'll get more invested into the story that you're creating, but you'll also be able to be surprised by how much progress you make, but you really have to force yourself to do it and be motivated. One of the biggest things that I think keeps people from writing is they'll write, like, a couple pages and then they'll just be like, oh, this sucks, I can't write anymore, which, I mean, I could have very easily done with Every Tiny Second. The first couple scenes I wrote of Every Tiny Second were, they've gotten better, but, like, they were probably the weakest scenes of the entire play. But the thing is you have to recognize that the only way to get better at writing is to write. The only way to get better is to keep going. You have to be committed to it. You can't just be like, oh, maybe I'll write a play someday. You have to be like, no, I'm actually going to write this, you know? And it takes a lot of motivation, which is hard, but you really have to be able to focus and try to get as much written as possible and not let doubt or fear get in the way of finishing things, you know? My next tip, with Every Tiny Second, one of the biggest problems I had with it was that my first draft was 200 pages, which is very long for a play. That's like more than 3 hours. My biggest problem was when I wrote my first draft, I didn't realize how long it was until I read it to other people and they were like, oh, this play is really long. And I was like, wow, it actually is pretty long. So the biggest thing I had a problem with when editing my play was trying to cut out scenes and cut out parts, and some of the parts I had to cut out were like I was really attached to the scenes that I had to cut, but it's like you kind of have to evaluate what's important and what's not important, you know? And it's really hard because like it's hard to like because one thing about writing is you get so attached to the things that you write and the things that you create, and I've had to cut so many of my favorite scenes of Every Tiny Second, but through that I was able to create a stronger story because the kind of person I am just in life, I just love to just ramble on and just like talk and talk and talk and talk and not say things that are like completely relevant all the time. So I think that went into my play quite a bit during my first draft. I think there were many times I had characters that had like a full paragraph of saying something, but really they only really needed a couple of sentences to say what they needed to say, you know? But in the long run, I do think it's better to have a ton of material and cut it down than to not have enough material and have to expand it, because it's easier to cut stuff than create stuff out of thin air. Now, I added a couple scenes in the version of Every Tiny Second I have now has scenes that weren't in the original draft. But those scenes were added because I put them in to expand the characters more, you know, and I made sure they were short. But the thing is, creating something that, for me, like, being like, oh, I have this 200-page draft, I can't believe I actually wrote that much, that kind of gave me the confidence to be like, wow, if I wrote that much, then I can condense it and make it better, you know? But it's really hard, and condensing is kind of hard with writing in general, just trying to make yourself sound like you're concise, but also able to get your point across, you know? Like I said before, with plays, you don't want to be too flowery with overly complex descriptions of things. Characters should talk like people. They shouldn't talk like the pages of a book, like talking about every little thing that happens, you know? It should just be short. Because, you know, honestly, how often when you're talking to your friends do you just sit there and monologue to them? Unless you're, like, really angry or really emotional, conversations are a two-way thing. They're, like, constantly interrupting and constantly, talking over each other. So that's everything I have today. I am currently figuring out when I'm going to perform my play. I was going to perform it at the end of April, at Utah State in the Black Box, but because of the coronavirus, I can't do that. So I might be performing it either this summer or, in the fall. A staged reading at the end of the semester is also a possibility. But right now, everything is way up in the air. But I really have enjoyed the process of creating this, and I hope that anybody who is thinking of playwriting or thinking of writing in any way, I just wanted to give some advice about my experience and the journey that I've been on, and I've enjoyed like every part of the journey of writing. The fact that this was like only like thoughts in my head like a year ago, and now it's actually real, is just, it's the most beautiful feeling there is. So just keep working on it, and you'll find that it's worth it, because when you have that finished draft, it's like the most amazing feeling in the world. So, thank you.